This is a park that's been built between the Georgia Dome, our football stadium, and the Convention Center and Phillips Arena. And it's built up at the elevated street level adjacent to Techwood Avenue. And you can see they've gone to a lot of trouble to introduce trees and water features and grass and plants, so that you really get the impression that this is the ground plane. But what we find is that actually we're elevated up several stories above the ground, and that we're standing on top of a giant parking structure. We are now at actually Magnolia Street, far underneath the plaza above us that's used for events at the Georgia Dome. So the Georgia Dome is over there, and the Convention Center halls are over there. And so not only is there a big public plaza up at the upper level, but actually the physical topography has dropped down in this location. And so instead of being 1, 2, or 3 stories difference, there's 6 or 8 stories of parking deck in this zone. And so effectively up at the upper level, we're masking out that change in topography, and there's this big dip in the city here. There's been multiple layers of infrastructure filling this in over the decades, and each time some new structure gets built, they add another layer, it seems. And so down here we get this amazing cavernous space that almost nobody knows about. We are on Magnolia Street again, basically between Phillips Arena and the Georgia World Congress Center, our convention center. And you can see behind me how there's literally layers of construction that date from various iterations of developments here. And Magnolia Street was part of our original historic street grid. And now above us it's the extension of International Boulevard coming out through Centennial Park. And you can still get here to access the parking, but you have to kind of take a different route now. And part of it has been gated off. And it raises questions about whether this is still public area or privately managed. As these areas become service zones, it's hard to tell if it's a public area or a private area, and that's continuing to hold true for other parts of the Gulch, as there's these proposals to redevelop. Of course, most of it is actually land owned by the railroads, but it's certainly within the public realm. You know, we want to redevelop it because it acts as a gap in our city. So there's questions and issues about whether it's public or private, and as an individual, do I feel comfortable even wandering around down here? At the height of railroad traffic, probably in the 1920s, this entire area was covered with railroad tracks, sidings, storage sidings, and railroad facilities. And of course that's all gone now, and the tracks have all gradually been pulled up. The siding behind me is one of the last remnants that hasn't been pulled up yet, that is no longer an active track. And in comparing it with the growth of the area and historic maps and drawings, It looks like this spur behind me is roughly aligned with the original Monroe Embankment. The Monroe Embankment was identified by our historian Franklin Garrett as Atlanta's oldest remaining man-made structure. Based on that, some of us had looked at the another embankment nearby that is still existing and misidentified that. The Monroe Embankment was built as part of the original triangular junction by the Monroe Railroad, which was building north from Macon. It quickly became known as the Macon and Western Railroad. And they acknowledged that to make their connection to the Western and Atlantic Railroad, they were going to have to span over some low-lying ground right here and build an embankment. And they hired a man named Cousin John Thrasher to start assembling that. And that was really the first work that happened here after Stephen Long had surveyed this as the location. And so there was a little encampment of railroad men that John Thrasher had assembled to build this embankment, and that was the first little settlement of people here, other than a few farmsteads. There's a man named Hardy Ivy who had a little farmstead north on Peachtree Street. So this village of workmen was known loosely as Thrasherville, named after John Thrasher. At the same time, the area was known as Terminus by the railroads just because it was a dot on the map. It was the end of the line, and so they called it Terminus. And those were two concurrent, kind of informal names. Then in 1843, there was enough people here that they were incorporated as the city of Marthasville, named after Martha Lumpkin, who is the daughter of Governor Lumpkin, who actually had years before helped survey the original line through the mountains. And that name didn't really catch on with the locals. You can imagine it was a frontier town full of railroad construction workers, had a rough and tumble reputation, and I don't think they took well to being called Marthasvillians or whatever they would have been called. So just 2 years later, it was renamed again as Atlanta, and there are a couple of theories about where that name came from. It turns out that Martha Lumpkin's middle name was Atalanta with an extra A, named after a Greek goddess, but she always denied that the city was named for her twice. We actually have some records of that show that the name was suggested by a engineer for the Georgia Railroad, and it makes some sense because 1845 is the year that the Georgia Railroad reached Atlanta, and they proposed this name Atlanta as the feminine form of Atlantic, and there might have been some idea that they now had a railroad that sort of connected the Atlantic ports to this new sort of inland junction called Atlanta.